It is truly a great pleasure to welcome you all to Dr. Beeta Baghoolizadeh's book launch of The Color Black: Enslavement and Erasure in Iran. Thank you so much, Dr. Beeta, for joining us today to discuss your much needed, highly anticipated, and just extremely beautifully written book that is politically and intellectually generative in so many ways, and we really cannot wait to be in conversation with you. My name is Paniz Musawi Natanzi, and I'm a Postdoctoral Associate in the Duke University Middle East Studies Center here at Duke. And before my wonderful colleague, Professor Khwezi Mkhize, introduces Ustad Baghoolizadeh to you, allow us to thank our co-sponsors at Duke who made this event possible. We would like to thank the Department for African and African American Studies, the Duke University Middle East Studies Center, and the History Department. And a big warm thank you to the team in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies and Professor Nash for hosting us here today in the Pink Parlor. And last but not least, thank you, Elizabeth Auld, Dr. Beeta's editor at Duke University Press, for sharing the joy and excitement of making this event happen and bringing Dr. Baghoolizadeh to Duke. And
Good afternoon, everyone. Khwezi Mkhize, the Department of African and American Studies, and I'll introduce Dr. Baghoolizadeh. Beeta Baghoolizadeh got a PhD in history at the University of Pennsylvania and is associate research scholar at Princeton University's Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. Her book, The Color Black: Enslavement and Erasure in Iran, published by Duke University Press just last month, examines questions concerning race, gender, historiography, and visuality, and has won the Scholars of Color First Book Award at Duke University Press. Beeta's scholarship is featured in comparative studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, Lateral, the Journal of the Critical Studies Association, and the American Historical Review. Prior to joining Princeton, Beeta was Associate Professor of History and Critical Black Studies at Bucknell University. Her research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, and she has also been a research fellow at the Bard Graduate Center and a regional faculty fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Wolf Humanities Center. Before we welcome Dr. Baghoolizadeh, I'll just break down the format of our conversation this afternoon. Dr. Baghoolizadeh is going to talk, I think, for about 20 minutes, so if I'm not mistaken. Both Paniz and I will ask a couple of questions and then we'll open it up to the floor. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Baghoolizadeh.
Everyone, thank you so much for coming on this beautiful Friday, spending it in this very pink room with me. I want to thank you all for coming, and also to my hosts, Paniz Musawi Natanzi and Khwezi Mkhize for organizing this talk, Elizabeth Auld for also hosting me, to Griffin Orlando for all the logistical work, and back and forth, and also all of the departmental and center sponsors that you heard, African American Studies, Duke University Middle East Studies Center, the History Department, Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. It's really, really nice to be able to share my work with you and to have it resonate with so many different departments on campus. So like you heard, my book just came out, The Color Black: Enslavement and Erasure in Iran. I work on constructions of race through the lens of slavery and abolition in Iran throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about this history and how it's been erased. So in 1977, the introduction to the Art of Black Africa exhibition was held in Tehran. It was sponsored by the Queen of Iran, Fahd. He was Foundation, Farabi University, National Iranian Radio and Television, and it featured pieces on loan from museums representing 14 countries in West or Central Africa. The exhibition included wooden masks like the one you see here, but also statues, ornamental objects, hair combs, staffs, swords, and other wood-carved objects. So for 6 weeks between November 1st to December 16th in 1977, people could visit mornings and afternoons to see them at Baghoolizadeh. So this exhibition was a big deal. Farhdiba herself described it at the opening event. That this exhibition was the first of its kind outside of Africa. The honorary committee had both Iranian and African officials and ambassadors. The catalogs were printed in multiple languages, one specifically in English and French, so you know they had envisioned this international audience. And you can see this is an announcement for the exhibition on opening day in a newspaper, and that's Farhdiba and Mohammad Azar Shah looking at these really large and beautiful wooden masks. In the catalog, they really stress the importance of this exhibition for being the first time Iran and Africa had met at a crossroads, that a bridge had been built between these places that were so far away from each other, that had never met before, that had never had any sort of cultural exchange before. The catalog also talked about the history of slavery and colonialism in Africa, especially the Atlantic slave trade, and how so many people had been enslaved from Africa and taken to the Americas. There's only one sentence that referred to slavery in the Middle East, and it does not refer to Iran. And you see I've highlighted it here, that Zanzibar and other places exported slaves to Arabia. This is a fascinating assertion, because not only was there a history of enslavement in Iran, a history of enslaving East Africans in Iran, this entire exhibit was held in a former palace where enslaved people had once served the royal family, enslaved people from East Africa. So this is how they were writing and rewriting these histories, replacing them with alternate fantasies. So let me just pause here and give some background on the history of enslavement in Iran. Elite and wealthy Iranians had for centuries enslaved peoples from around Iran, from the Caucasus, Central Asia, South Asia, and East Africa. In domestic spaces, as nannies, wet nurses, eunuchs, cooks, and other critical forms of labor that were important for managing the everyday life of the enslaving family. They were, for the large part, symbols of status and power. And we also have examples of chattel slavery in the South with pearl divers or date plantations, but my research really focuses on the enslaved within urban spaces, because those people were so close to power that their presence and their gradual disappearance, their gradual erasure, really shaped the discourse of race and racism on a national scale. So what's strange is that in the Iranian case, even though there were all these different types of people who were considered categorically enslavable and vulnerable to enslavement in Iran, by the late 19th century, because of geopolitical shifts that I can talk about in the Q&A, really East Africans remained the last dominant group of people being enslaved in Iran. And this causes a particular language of slavery and enslavement and racialization to rise in Persian, where Black became equivalent to enslaved, and that in turn shaped a specific type of anti-Blackness. This was a racism that was virulent, but after abolition in Iran would be actively denied and erased. So the first move towards the abolition of the slave trade was in 1848. It was a decree banning the trafficking of enslaved peoples into the Persian Gulf ports. And about 70 years later, the Iranian parliament passed a law freeing all enslaved people in 1929, bringing the end of legal enslavement in Iran. So we have the 70-year period here where It was a period of forced visibility, right? It was a period that framed legal enslavement in Iran, where Iranians who were able to enslave someone in their homes enslaved East Africans. And by doing so, they were signaling that they wanted to be seen as enslavers and that they wanted the people that they enslaved to be seen as enslaved, to be seen as Black. And after abolition in 1929, like I've mentioned already, Iranians really restructured their society to accommodate a life without enslaved labor, and in the process, rewrote their histories and redesigned society to erase slavery completely. But my research also looks at the legacies of this history. So I look beyond that 1929 date to pretty much almost the present day. After abolition in 1929, Iranians had to restructure their society to accommodate a life without enslaved labor, and in the process, rewrote their histories to erase slavery completely. So you can see how the first half of the book looks at the final period of legal enslavement in Iran, and the second half of the book looks at erasures and the afterlives of these erasures. But I do want to share that this is not how my research started. When I first started working on this project 12 years ago, I knew that there were instances of enslavement within Iran, but whenever I asked anyone, be it regular Iranians or scholars or archivists, the response was very much, oh, we didn't have slaves, Iranians didn't have slaves, we're not racist, you must be talking about America, you are so American. And this is where I share that I am an Iranian American, so sure. But there was a history of enslavement. And I wanted to figure out exactly what that history was, to the point where the original working title of my project was From Slave to Citizen. I was really interested in this very real transition from being enslaved to gaining legal status as an equal member of society after 1929. But as Christina Sharp has written, those of us who teach, write, and think about slavery and its afterlives encounter myriad silences and ruptures in time, space, history, ethics, and research as we do our work. And as I researched, I came up against more examples of those silences, of those ruptures. And that's really what pushed me to conceive of this book as one of two halves: first enslavement and second erasures. I do want to share that these erasures run so deep that they even pervaded archival institutions. So this is a document that's held at a branch of the National Archives in Iran, and you can see here at the center, we have a historical document from the late 19th century, but then there's this weird fake border, like from, I don't know, Microsoft Word or something. I really don't know where it came from. But it was clearly added recently and clearly added within the archives. And so at the bottom here, it's not going to work on the screen, but at the bottom you can see it says example of wedding contract. But this is not a wedding contract. It's been digitized at Harvard's Women's World in Raja, Iran, digital archive as a sale document, but it's not exactly a sale document either. This is actually a text summarizing the conflict and resolution about a sale that happened in the past. The seller claimed that they hadn't received proper compensation for the sale of a Black man named Salman. But ultimately, they came to a compromise and received more money for the sale. The person who had purchased Salman gave a lump sum of money to the person who was writing this document, and that this testimony was drafted. Whoever created this border at the Yazd branch of the National Archives in Iran clearly had not paid attention when they were reading the document. In the last line of the document, there's this phrase. It says "Sireh Masaleh." We can roughly translate Sireh Masaleh to a vow of reconciliation, but those of us who know Persian know that Sireh is often used to refer to a marriage vow. And so whoever was skimming this document was not skimming it very well. They went to the last slide, literally the last slide, right? Said, great, it says Sireh, this is a wedding contract. Created this fake wedding border and called it a day. This isn't a one-off mistake. It's a reflection of the attitudes around enslavement and Iran's history of enslavement. So I want to end with a photograph. And I want to make a note about photographs in my book. I took their inclusion in my work very seriously, especially because I came to recognize that the photographs were an extension of their enslavement. And I want to tread carefully with them. So at the same time, these photographs are now part of the erasure of enslavement. They circulate in digital spaces, on social media, and other spaces. And these photographs and others like them are often referenced in claims that slavery in Iran was not bad. It was not slavery at all. And that the enslaved were part of the family. So it's been important for me to address these photographs and to correct that context. This particular photograph and the way that it circulated has really stayed with me. So this is another photograph that's been published both in Iran and in the US. In Iran, it's in a volume published by the Parliamentary Archives and Library of Iran, Kitabkhoneh Majlis, on women's issues during the constitutional revolution. And then again, it's been digitized in Harvard's Women's World and Raja Iran archive. It's a photograph of a clearly elite and enslaving family. Not many families would have been able to take a photograph like this. This photograph was taken in the late 19th century, probably 1890s, or maybe the very early 1900s. Not many families would have had access to this. This is not a photograph that was even taken in a studio. It was probably taken in their home. And we know that because it was taken outside in their backyard or their courtyard. Usually, if they had gone to a studio, they would have had a very Europeanized studio backdrop. But this family opted to have a sort of white curtain draped over their brick wall, and they hauled an oil painting from inside their home into their courtyard to show that this is an elite family. We have a gilded oil painting that we can include in our photograph. The woman in the middle is the matriarch. There are children, some of her children are standing around her. The individuals in the back were servants. It was a very bright and sunny day. We can see two of them have their hands up like this to prevent the sun from getting in their eye. I can talk more about this photograph in the Q&A. But for now, I want to focus on the little girl to the left. Right here. In the Parliamentary Archive volume, the volume published by Kitabkhoneh Majlis, she's identified as Juju. Juju is a sweet term of endearment. It's a sort of childish way of saying Juje, or a little chick. It's something parents will use for their children. But in the digital archive at Harvard, she's labeled with a much more vulgar name. She's labeled as Suski. This is the diminutive of the word susk, or cockroach. How did these two archives get such different names? Why such different connotations? And neither of them are names at all. And I should say, everyone else's name in this portrait has a stable name. Their name is identical between the two records, except for the three individuals in the back, because they're servants, and servants were cycled in and out of households. They're not named. When I was in Tehran doing field work at the Parliamentary Archives, I asked one of the editors of the volume, who's an archivist at the archives, I asked him, why is she labeled as Juju in the volume? Juju is not a name. He shrugged and said, better than having no name at all. And the question arises, better for who? Who are these records for? Who is this history for? And those are the questions I want to leave with you all today. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you. So we're just gonna ask a couple of questions to you, Peter, and then we'll open it up to audience. The first one is about disciplines. The Color Black is located between Middle Eastern Studies, Black Studies, and to an extent, Indian Ocean Studies, in order to articulate the archive of East African slavery in Iran. Can you reflect on how these fields have shaped your thinking of slavery in Iran? I'm fascinated, for instance, that Swahili words or words that I understand to be Swahili, such as kaka and dada, were used to facilitate the intimate estrangements your book explores.
Thank you so much. The book is a history of modern Iran. I really wanted to write a history of Iran that showed that you really could not have a history of modern Iran without addressing the history of enslavement and abolition. But I did not want it to be only a history of Iran. That was also very important for me to place it within a global context, for me to connect the patterns of enslavement that are happening, that were happening across the Middle East and East Africa, alongside, studies on the Atlantic slave trade, and studies of race in the Americas, which have historically been so divided, right? The historiography in Middle East studies has been very bifurcated, right? You have this sort of genealogy of people who, like Bernard Lewis and others like him, who really wanted to emphasize how Islam is racist and Muslims are racist, and the Middle East is just racist completely, and it's unchanging from time immemorial, which has its own political agenda, right? And then you have this reaction to it that was really taken up by Middle East studies for a couple generations, where no, there's no such thing as race, and there's no such thing as racism within the Middle East, and they don't see color, and we can see that because so many different groups were categorically enslavable within Iran. And it was really important for me, and I think it's fair to say that I'm part of a generation of scholars who are coming forward with a much more dynamic understanding of race, but race is not something that's unchanging, whether or not it exists or does not exist. It's a dynamic category of analysis. It's something that has to be taken into consideration, just like gender, just like class, just like religion. These it's a category of analysis that can help us understand modes of changing societal norms or power or oppression. And I think people have been really reticent to sort of connect these different area studies or fields of study together. And disciplinarily, I am a historian, but I did find myself borrowing from other disciplines, because my book is a little strange for a history book, because it does come up to the present day, and I do sort of toggle back and forth between me as a researcher in the archival space and then the stuff I'm finding in the archives. The question you posed about the different Swahili terms that exist in Persian, like kaka, which exists in different dialects of Persian and has very many different valences, right? We were talking about this earlier with Paniz, like in the Afghan dialect of Persian, you have kaka means uncle. In certain cities, kaka simply means brother. But in certain spaces, and this was true, I think, across urban spaces in Iran in the 19th century, and then now is something you see much more in southern Iran, where there is a visible and significant Black community. It's a racial slur, and it's used against a Black man. When I put that in my book, there were several people who read it and they said, "I don't believe you. I don't think it's from Swahili." And then they Google Translate it, which I thought was really interesting, because there's this sort of knee-jerk reaction that Iranian history is so bounded, that it's so nationally oriented. And that there's no sort of geographic exchange. Now, I'm not saying it comes from Persian or it comes from Swahili, but there is a connection somehow, surely. And we have to sort of zoom out. So that's what I mean when I say it was really important for me to be able to articulate that this is a modern history of Iran that needs to be written, but it needs to be written in connection with a sort of global outlook and other spaces and regions around the world.
Yeah, so I'll just add that we actually discuss chapters from the book in the pro seminar, African American Studies, alongside Bio Halsey's Roots of Remembrance. So there are, I think, very interesting sections around, I think in African studies there are ways in which enslavement and slavery is remembered. I think that are sort of shared concerns. But one of the things to come to the question of slavery, race, and emancipation, for me, just before I ask the question, I mean, one of the striking things was there's a moment where one of the women was sort of negotiating her own path toward freedom, right? So the idea that then the British would abolish slavery and can then sort of see Iran as a sort of state that is not modernized. So then you see people are sort of suspended between sort of these different sort of axes of power. And one of the most striking sort of references and encounters with the archive in the book was this moment where you cite that when the British are sort of looking to sort of find out sort of these remnants of enslavement in ships, they would actually pour boiling water into the ships, and people screamed. Then they found them, or they would just shoot bullets into it, and the people died. But that's evidence. And it was really striking to me how the British would sort of almost a century after emancipation come to sort of represent this form of progress that is quite recursive as far as its own sort of forms of racialized violence, right? So my question is, slavery ended in 1929 in Iran. It's a complicated history that you tease out. The context of its ending had to do with the modernization of the Iranian state under the shadow of the British Empire. Claims of race articulated whiteness, I beg your pardon, and East Africans with East African slavery as marking difference. On the other hand, you argue that Iranians have resisted comparisons with American slavery, as you've said. Can you reflect on the relationship between slavery and racial identity in Iran before and after 1929?
Yeah, thank you so much. Working in the British archives on these sort of, just have piles of boxes that are labeled slavery and anti-slavery. And they make it very easy if you want to work on slavery, you just sort of like Google the term slavery. And there's so many files that come up. And you're like, wow, leading abolitionists of the world, like really living up to its name. And then you start reading the documents, and so many of them, there are people like the one you mentioned, who's remembered in the archives as Khwezi. She proves that she was trafficked and smuggled in illegally and sold as an enslaved woman to a man. She gives evidence, and when I say proves, she tells them who the name of the ship captain was, when her ship came in, where she was from, and it was a few years after the first banning of the Persian Gulf slave trade. So the British accept this at face value. And she brings a younger boy to the offices, and she says he was also enslaved on the same ship. Again, gives the same amount of evidence, and they say, yeah, that makes sense. He should be freed as well. And then it turns out that he was enslaved by someone who was pretty powerful, and the British don't want to deal with him, and they don't want trouble, so they push the boy back into enslavement. We don't know what happens to Khwezi, but they definitely push the boy back into enslavement, but the paper trail of Khwezi disappears. But Matthew Hopper has written on sort of these abolitionist moves, and he's written that like he's found in the archives, they're shipped to different places. They're never shipped back to where they were enslaved from. They're shipped to different places where they were almost guaranteed to face various types of abuse or die. They're really not helped in terms of finding their freedom. In Iran, if they were there if they went to the British offices in the south to procure their manumission papers, they were put to work in the meantime. They cooked, they procured, they ran errands. Sounds very similar to the types of things that they were supposedly running away from, right? So the British legacy is very it's very much sanitized from like a British history perspective, and it's very messy once you read the documents. The documents are also they run contrary to a lot of their narratives. But in the question of racialization, the sort of racialization that Iranians had of themselves in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, you had terms like white and black used for enslaved people. So a white enslaved woman would have referred to Caucasians and Central Asians. A black enslaved woman prior to the 19th century often would have included South Asians alongside East Africans. Once the South Asian slave trade is sort of closed off because of British imperialism, once you have the Russian imperialism strengthened in the north, and that also closes off those routes of trafficking, that East Africans, as the last sort of dominant group of enslaved people in Iran, really cements the term Black in Persian. And that's why the book is titled The Color Black, because Siyah, literally the color Black, becomes not just an adjective where you can say an enslaved Black man, but then you have the ability in Persian to say Siyah, the Black, and it refers to a person. This doesn't happen to the word white. You cannot use Sefid in the 19th century for it to just stand alone as a white person. It does occur now in like American dialects of Persian amongst immigrant communities and the diaspora, but it refers to like white people. It's a translation from white people into Persian now. But that doesn't, Sefid does not refer to, like Sefid as a noun does not exist in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, you don't really see Iranians buy into a racial binary until this term Black is cemented in that way. And that's when you start seeing the sort of entrance of Aryanism and the entrance of this identification as with white as a marker for being an Iranian, which becomes much, much stronger in the 20th century and continues into diaspora today. And we have Neda Mahfouz's book, The Limits of Whiteness, where she talks about this fraught relationship with the Aryan myth and also whiteness in the American diaspora. So this is what I mean. It's a very dynamic category, and it's shifting very quickly throughout the 19th and 20th centuries.
I have a question for both of you. You're now on the spot. Because I think our works also, again, like the question of where our disciplinary places are in the universities, kind of they do the performance of divide and conquer within the neoliberal university, right? Often depending on the departmental or center specific places we inhabit, we having these sort of conversations around nation building, empire, state building, war. The slavery did not come into being, right? As Khwezi's first question and your replies also highlighted. So considering the dominant connections between archives and nation and empire building processes, how do archival practices in the present look like, or can look like, that neither romanticize, vilify, nor infantilize interlocutors, the living and the past, right? The ones that are silent in the archives with no names, as well as those with names, but also caught in imperial projects of the present. In other words, what makes present-day archival practices generative? Can you think of examples from the sites in which you're situated?
I mean, yeah, it's your first question.
Yeah, I mean that. Yeah, I think that some of the things, I mean, there's a course that I'm involved with called Black Archival Imagination. That the idea of imagination also has to do with how both historical and contemporary Black thinkers, writers, different categories engage with the question, problem of the archive. Because I think within sort of colonial moments and encountered, various kinds of people were sort of engaging with different processes of archiving, right? And with the question of the archive. I mean, in terms of the color Black, I mean, it's one of the fascinating thing for me about Beeta's book is the way that you sort of engage with sort of reading images, right? And there's a fascinating sort of picture that has one of the enslaved people, his skin color reflects on the images similar to the person who's not enslaved. And so the family member makes it a point to actually write that this person is not, right? So there are these sort of paratextual gestures. So it's not that you're reading form in these really interesting ways, you're reading all these other kinds of annotations that speak to these anxieties as well. And I think it's interesting and something. For me, those kinds of gestures resonate, for instance, with the work of Carrie Mae Weems, right? So she sort of encounters, I can't remember the sort of archive, it's in Harvard of these sort of anthropological images of African people and the way that she sort of changes the color and begin to sort of engage with sort of textualizing those images also speaks to an attempt to sort of humanize these people, right? But also to think about South Africa, we cannot sort of escape this sort of complicity generally of sort of photography and the biometric state. So, in the anti-apartheid movement, you also had people who sort of protested Kodak, because Kodak was producing the technology for actually producing the past images was coming from the US, right? So, I mean, you have that kind of history, and then you have, there's this wonderful photographer called Santu Mkhize, who in the early 90s actually started collecting images from Black families all over South Africa. And it turns out throughout the 20th century, many of these images when people sort of, trunks, suitcases, etc. But somehow people had kept these images over generations, right? So he's already engaging with questions of alternative archiving. But if you read some of those images in the book called the Black Photo Album, alongside Diane Cronin, who produced this book of sort of the Bantu tribes of South Africa, right? Sort of image making as creating an archive of the Bantu as a kind of ethnic and racial type. So again, one particular archive exists in a particular relationship to the colonial and apartheid state. The other one is literally languishing in people's sort of personal spaces, and some of the stuff has been lost. So questions of precarity, but I think there's a very strong argument to be made about how does one engage with Black and other forms of sort of non-official sort of ways of archiving. What does one do with that? And I think you give an example of how one sort of engages with an archive that is sort of, it exists in a complicated relationship to these questions, and yet it's important, including the question of you show these images in the book, but you not show them, you make a decision to show them precisely because of how do you counter questions of erasure. Yeah. So there are ethical questions around there that your book is also addressed.
That was such a full answer. I really appreciate all of that. Every single photograph that I had come across in my book, that I had come across in the archives prior to 3 months ago, was held by the enslaved family and their descendants. So if we're going to talk about a generative practice, it would be, where are these photographs that are languishing in people's suitcases and chest drawers, and do they want to include them? Maybe they don't. Maybe they don't, and they have totally valid reasons for not. I say 3 months ago because someone emailed me with a photograph of their great-grandfather who was enslaved at one of the royal courts. And that was the first time I had seen a photograph that was held by the descendant of the person who was enslaved. That was shared with me. Doesn't mean it's the first time it exists. That just means that person trusted me with it, to show it, enough to show it to me. This distinction between what's languishing and what's being pushed forward, right? I mean, these photographs that are held by the enslaving families and their descendants, they really do a lot of work for the enslaving families then and now, right? Then it showed how great their status was. Look, we can enslave people. Now they're totally flipped on their heads and shown as, look, our family cared about Black people so much. And there are memoirs published with chapter titles like Black Members of Our Family, completely unironically, right? And you're reading it, and the person really is doing so many different types of mental gymnastics to convince themselves that this person was not enslaved, that our family was not like that. And yet, every single point they're sharing about this person sounds like enslavement, right? Looks like enslavement, even in the photograph. But because the erasure is so deep, right, there's really not that strong of like a social popular memory, a communal memory that people can be like, no, this sounds like, or this is enslavement. People are like, oh wow, that's so interesting. Your family was so diverse, or whatnot. And that's why I ultimately came to this conclusion that I had to show the images, because it was precisely this type of photography where a little enslaved girl is shoved to the side of a photograph. Yeah. Did she put herself there? Did someone push her to the side? Did someone tell her, hey, you should stand to the side? How did this little girl end up on the margins of this photograph, where every other photograph I've seen of enslaved Black people, they're on the margins of the photograph, right? Including in these photos that are being reproduced in memoirs, whatever diverse families or whatever they're framing it as. I'm sure Liz remembers, I had this like very panicked phone call with her during the pandemic. Like, I don't want to show the photographs, like I don't know what to do. Should I trace them? Should I blur them? And ultimately, I at the time worked with the Collective for Black Iranians as their resident historian, and I had a pretty long conversation with them where they sort of unanimously were like, please publish these photographs so that like people regularly go up to Black Iranians and said, oh, I didn't know you existed, right? Because the erasures are so deep. And so they really pushed for that inclusion of the photographs. And I think it was the right choice, because I think the context needs to be corrected. Because the way people have analyzed them can be so misleading. That doesn't really answer how to make it generative, but just.
You did, like you alluded also to actually so much of collaborative work that you've been actually doing with the collective of Black Iranians, right? Would you like to talk a bit about that? As the resident historian, like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think it's just important for us to challenge sort of default positionality of non-Black Iranians when telling the history of Iran or the surrounding region. And so, and that includes myself, and that includes, you know, collaborating with Black Iranians, using modes that are not necessarily considered acceptable or like not considered acceptable, but going beyond what is normatively in academia to share this work. I think that's all really, really important. And rethinking of what an archive is, you know.
That's so beautifully in your book, because you basically also, by asking those questions, I feel like you're already showing pathways towards reimagining, which are not necessarily don't have to be solution oriented, but just knowing what questions also maybe to ask, right? Are maybe a way towards reimagining. But thank you so much for like all these rich responses that give us so much to think about and to sit with. Should we open? Yeah, should we open the floor for questions from the audience first, like maybe in person, and then we can shift to online questions. Is there any question here?
I'm curious, so you mentioned in the top, the second half of the book about examples kind of coming up to the present day, and you just maybe alluded to a few of these memoirs. But I'm wondering if you had more to say about some of the ways that these erasures continue in the present, if there are cultural practices or other things that are in the book about the way the continued erasure of the presence of Black Iranians generally and of the history of Enslavement as well.
So many. When I first started my research, the number one thing I heard was, you can't study that because Cyrus the Great freed all the slaves. And it sounds silly if you're not Iranian, but it is such a it's so commonly repeated. It's really, really commonly repeated. It sort of all started in like 1968. Reza Shah is trying to rehabilitate his image as like a dictator, as an authoritarian ruler with human rights abuses. So he comes up with this idea that the Cyrus Cylinder was the first human rights document. And in 1971, his sister, Princess Ashraf, dedicates a replica of the Cyrus Cylinder to the United Nations, which you can see if you go to, I think, the New York Bridge. This takes off in a way in the Iranian memory, to the extent where, I don't know if anyone here is from Southern California, but I'm from Southern California. So there's a park in San Diego, it's called Willow Park. It's for the Iranians who are familiar, it's a very popular park to go to for the 13th day of the year, Suzadedah, where you're supposed to go to. This park has a plaque in it that the Iranian community of San Diego has put together. And it's like a plaque dedicated to Cyrus the Great, who freed all the slaves and promoted democracy everywhere. And it's like, what if, you know, I mean, that's a paraphrase, but like, that's basically what it says. So there's just this sort of alternate understanding of history. The Persian dictionary, the most important sort of dictionary for the Persian language today is recognized as Dekhoda's Blackness. Dekhoda was an intellectual between the 1930s and 1950s. He's working on this Persian dictionary. He passes away. His partner finally publishes an edition of it in the 1950s. In 1929, the manumission law in Persian that was published on the front pages of the newspaper that was sort of celebrated as, okay, we have abolished slavery, uses the term Baghdad, right? This is the catch-all term for slavery in Persian. By the time this dictionary is published. The term bandit is not a catch-all term for slavery, for an enslaved person anymore. It's now made to only really refer to plantation or chattel slavery. And so the definition, the way the LOAC is structured is you have the term, the definition, and then you have sort of textual uses of the term, so like poetry to show how the term's been used over centuries, because Persian as a language is a pretty stable language, so you have a lot of different like canonical pieces of literature to draw upon when you're defining a term. This term, and I don't have a slide for it, but if you picture a dictionary page, right, like 3 columns, every column is split between 5 to 10 words. The term "baghoolizadeh," which is the term for slavery or enslavement, the catch-all term, it's a column and some spillover, uniquely long, gives a full-blown history of slavery from time immemorial. Started with the Greeks and the Romans, moves on to like U.S. colonies, U.S. Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, Geneva Convention of 1946 ended slavery worldwide. End definition. Slavery did not end in Europe until 1929. Why? Why this definition? Well, they got this definition from the Persian Encyclopedia. Where did the Persian Encyclopedia get this definition from? From the Columbia Dictionary of 1953. So they're translating US-centric definitions into Persian, and then saying, okay, this is the definition, and sort of speeding up this process of erasure. This is the same, this definition is unchanging. I've seen it in print, right? I've seen it on microfilm. I have the iPad app for this dictionary, still in the iPad app, right? So like, this is an unchanging definition. And so when I would do my research, I'd say at the beginning, I might have said, oh, I work on Baghoolizadeh, and people would say, that's not a thing. That is the exact term that was used to free people who were enslaved, but now it's not a thing. So you have a lasting effect in the Persian language. And then probably the most vulgar and grotesque legacy of enslavement in Iran is blackface theater. It's vehemently funded. It's sort of regarded as folk theater, Khwezi, literally playing black. There is a minstrel that is sort of separate from the theater, but every year on Persian New Year, there's a Haji famous blackface minstrel who dances and tells his master to sing and be happy. And people will do backflips to say this is not blackface, and this was not an enslaved person, and this is nothing to do with this history of enslavement. And I do, if I do say so myself, I do a pretty good job of outlining exactly where this comes from, the history of enslavement and the history of eunuchs at the royal court, how they were mocking eunuchs for their castration. They were highlighting their hypersexualization and their desexualization, and how this becomes a key and critical part of blackface theater. They're speaking in high-pitched voices. They speak in Pidgin Persian. They are. There's often in the theater plotline, there's often some sort of romantic story where this is not a suitable person for marriage, but is often lusting after someone. Really bringing in all of the stereotypes and all the things that were sort of shape the stereotypes about eunuchs into a full form of theater. So I think outside of memoirs, I would say those are some of the more lasting ones: the history, the way it's reshaped, the language, how that's been rewritten, and then the theater, how it's so defended.
And I'm really eager to read your book and to learn more about it. And I have actually, what am I going to call it? I actually have 2 different types of questions and kind of maybe. I was wondering if you've included any of the performance traditions the ritual traditions, for example, the ritual itself, in the Arabic written about it, the context. So I guess that's the first question.
Did you say you've written about it?
No, you.
Oh, no. I was like, I didn't know. So I did not write about Tsar. And I alluded to some other types of performance and religious rituals in both the book and article. But I didn't specifically write about Tsar because I feel like, well, first, I'm not an anthropologist, and so that it would have required some kind of ethnography for me to do that because I'm not, there's no like written record of it that I found. So I wasn't able to find some sort of historical record about it that would have been helpful. But I also didn't write about it because I felt like there's been a lot done on it, and it's often used. I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I am gonna make a blanket statement, but just like with all the caveats. Often it feels like it's fetishizing Black Iranians to focus on Zod. And I think that it wasn't necessarily helpful for me and my book to focus on it. So I don't yeah.
I guess, I mean, the reason why I ask, in terms of Tsar as a ritual, like that was, I guess, as my understanding, historically performed on the ships as the slaves were being brought over the African continent to Iran. That these rituals were used as a way to purge the evil spirits of the shore that were entering through the winds on the shorelines.
Yeah.
And in my understanding, these were spirits of enslavement. These were embodiments of the trauma of enslavement, yeah, we translate it as, you know, as trauma, PTSD, etc.
Right.
You know. And so I was thinking about the approach that we could take to an archive like that you have. I mean, I guess one way to go about it is to go to the Qajar archive, which was essentially the Qajar Women's Archive, which was essentially created in the aftermath of gender as a category of analysis, right? And as a result of that, to uncover the lives of Iranian women in the Qajar archives. And what would be the evolution of that study today? Would that be thinking about intersectionality in reading the archive? And I'm wondering if that is the path that you take. And then I'm thinking of the other route, which would be through the route of the ritual traditions of Islam, where you are essentially going into family archives.
Yeah.
You are going into the families in which these lives have been enslaved, and purging, and essentially purging the traumas.
Yeah.
I know this sounds strange, but
no, I understand.
Yeah,
I'm following. So there's a lot there, and I think it's important. Like, I think the ritual of Zara is a very important one, and it wasn't a discounting of the ritual. There is something about the sort of silences around Blackness that I encountered when I was in Iran doing field work in the South. I was in Bushehr and that was too. The erasures were not just from the government or the enslaved families, but free peoples and their descendants did not talk about their Blackness, and they did not talk about their history, their family histories of enslavement in the period that I was doing my fieldwork. I think that has changed a bit. I think it's shifted a bit. I think the work of the collective has made it much more, has made a space where people are now much more open to talking about it. But the stigma of enslavement and the stigma of being identified as Black even was so heavy that it felt really wrong for me to be like, well, I'm working on my dissertation. I would really like to talk to you about your family history of being Black and enslaved. Like it that felt very violent to me, right? And I didn't pursue it. Definitely someone should pursue it. And I think there are more openings to researching those family histories. And like I said, there are people who now approach me with helping them research their family histories. It just wasn't something that I could do for the research for this book, because even the term Iranian was not used. Even the term Afro-Iranian was not used. The closest one that was used was Iranian of African ancestry. But even that, like the person had to be, it was not used within the community openly. And someone who has worked on Zara is like Paniz Musawi, right? And her documentary, she sort of, she repeatedly asks this man, who is visibly Black. You've seen this documentary.
Yeah.
She asks this man who's visibly Black several times, so where are you from? Where are you from? Where are you from? And each time he's like, I'm Iranian, I'm Iranian, I'm Iranian. And like really is not letting up that he is Iranian and he belongs there. And that's fair. There are centuries of Black people belonging to Iran. Iran is not just some sort of country that is only not Black, but very, very strongly emphasizes that he's Iranian. And then finally she says, well, what languages do you speak? And he says, well, I understand some Swahili. And so she has this analysis, right, about his ancestry that I found very uncomfortable, right? Like I didn't feel comfortable having that kind of outside understanding where I come and tell someone, well, you look different, you know. So that's why I didn't pursue it. But I do think it would be generative if that conversation was open to being had, right?
Yeah, even like you've on the psychoanalysis like that
Yeah.
into the archive.
Yeah. Was there some? Oh, okay.
Thank you so much, Margaret. It's great. Thank you. Hi, Carol. I have a question about that film. I'm wondering if you have watched it or not. The Collapse of Southern Iran by Farhan Bahram, the documentary, and if so, what do you think about that? And about the stigma that you mentioned, I have a kind of similar experience. I started research years ago, and I stopped it because yes, then I asked some questions about the history and the backgrounds of some families I interviewed. I faced the problem that yes, they prefer not to talk about it because of the cultural things that is so dominant. I'm from Shiraz, so there is a term in Fasad, a city near Shiraz. I'm curious to know if you have heard it during your research, Kulu. And we have a lot of these people, and their appearance is different, and the others think that they are not from the same background as the other people of the city. And so I stopped the research. I appreciate if you give me any advice that in how can I continue this research and in what approach I have to follow to be able to connect Wait.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, Fahad Baraham's documentary, Siyah al-Junub, or the Black people in the South. Like the documentary I mentioned earlier, there seems to have been this history of documentary making, and it sort of starts with Nasser Khweizi's work, with Bijan, with Archival. Almost every decade, there is a new documentary that comes out. Often it is framed as discovering Black people in Iran. And I really have to place his work within this long line of not just film, but also photography, where Black Iranians are highlighted, and they're meant to be introduced on a national scale, right? Baraham's work is also interesting because there's almost no audio, right? There's no plot. It's just images after images after images, and it provides a context that's also heavily decontextualized, which is similar to Nasser Khweizi's Archival, which is also just the imagery of it, right? And Khwezidah's recitations for Archival. In terms of how to do this research, I think the question would be, why do you want to do this research? And once you have the sort of motivations behind the research, you can sort of build out from there. And this is not about you, but I have found there are people within the academy who really did not work on Blackness at all. And then we had like the 2020 BLM protests, and suddenly everyone now works on Blackness. But it's not you, right? Because your work seems to have created that. But there is a sort of bandwagoning, and it has something to do with like the trendiness of the topic. And so a lot of projects are motivated by the trendiness of it, and so that shapes what the project looks like and how and what their approaches are, I think. It sounds like you want to be a bit more aware, right? And so I would maybe interviewing is not the strategy. Maybe it is, depending on who you're able to speak with. But I think that it's good to just be mindful of the sort of your own positionality and their positionality, and what does it do? What is the point of it? For me, I really wanted to write a book that was important, not just for the academy, but also as an Iranian American. The history continues today, right? I see this history pervade the Iranian community, and so for me, I also wanted the book to be accessible to a non-academic community where we could potentially move forward beyond the sort of racist, exclusivist things that had shaped the community. So that was my motivation, and that sort of shaped why I approached the book the way I did, because I needed to counter sort of things that had pervaded not only Iranian studies, because Iranian studies is so shaped by like an elite scholarly family historian or whoever, but also the broader.
We have one question from the online audience. Jeremy Dell is asking, are there plans to translate the book to Persian?
Hello, Jeremy. You get to hear from Edinburgh. Where is he? Jeremy Dell. That's a very important question, and totally dovetails what I was saying in my last answer. It is It's a little shaky. I would love for the book to be translated into Persian. Iran does not recognize copyright law, right? And so if someone in Iran decides to translate it, they may translate it into Persian without any of us ever knowing, and then we will find out later.
We'll just find it all the time.
We'll find out later. No, I don't know. I don't know. I would really like for it to be accessible in Persian. It's hard for me to navigate that right now. Since I'm based in the US, I'm not in touch with publishers per se in Tehran. And like I said, it might just get picked up without anyone ever contacting me. I think that happens pretty commonly with books that are deemed sort of popular enough or anticipated enough. So I don't have a good answer for you. My work has been translated into Persian before. There's an article that I wrote a few years ago on this sort of history of Persian feudalism. It's very short, it's like 3,000 words. And I did not arrange for this, but it was published a week before the Persian New Year. So a week before this clock-based minstrel was going to appear on the streets. Because it ended up coming out during the pandemic, it went super viral because everyone was just very much on Twitter and very much on their phones. And I think it came out on March 15th. And by March 22nd, the Tehran mayor's office had said that they were banning blackface in their minstrel shows, and then cited my article. So definitely people are reading this work in some form or another in Iran. It's just a matter of I don't know how it will. I don't know what the next steps will be for translation.
Jeremy has a very sweet, I read it as a compliment. He's saying a street translation is the highest compliment that can be paid to an academic book.
Thank you, Jeremy Bell from Edinburgh.
There is another compliment, and let's share it. I think that's important. Yeah, let's share it along. Catherine is writing, bravo for your presentation, important research in your book. This will be a tremendous help in researching family history as well as understanding Iranian history. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions from our online audience or our audience here in Pink Park?
I feel like maybe it's rename it to like salmon.
Apparently there was some agreement. Khwezi, we had one more question. I do. About photographs and artifacts, do you think? We covered it sort of, yeah. I was thinking also about the question of actually, so you so beautifully described this temporality within which the narratives around Blackness are constructed, and I think this temporality, as you just also said, tells us a lot about class. Actually, it's an elite imperial narrative that is quite dominant and also has a public life of its own, right? So in what ways do you, also both of you, please feel free to reply to that. In what ways have you seen notions of or understandings of racializing processes, right, becoming more nuanced and complex as they're, I think your book, what it's beautifully doing is taking us by the hand and really asking these essential political and intellectual questions about constructions of Blackness in Iran and the whiteness of Iranian studies, but also how can it, you also bring, for instance, the question of Baluchistan, right, towards the end of your book. So in what ways does actually engaging and sitting with the question of Blackness and anti-Blackness in modern Iran also invite us to look at other sides of racializing processes in the country as well as in wider West Asia. And how does it help us actually to remap then how we come to know how Africa and Asia relate to each other, epistemologically as well as politically? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give a simple kind of, it should be a South African example, but it's questionable if it is. I lived in Cape Town for about 3 years. And one of those years, on the 1st of December, the people that are referred to as colored people in South Africa, not African, not white, not Indian, right? Supposedly from kind of history of, race mixing and all the complicated forms of violence that they've encountered. Were the only people, and in Cape Town, the only place where the emancipation was actually commemorated and celebrated. Right? So for me, one of the striking things about it is how, in a country like South Africa, where the shadow of apartheid is quite substantial, and the way, for instance, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission thought about questions of human rights violation in relation to the temporality of apartheid, in itself also, without explicitly stating it, is its own sort of particular genealogy of racialization, right? Where the longer histories of colonialism and enslavement, but also the Dutch history of the sort of Cape becomes sort of written up, right? And then you're dealing with the Indonesian, Ceylon, diaspora that come from the Dutch East India Company and its particular sort of history. So I think for me, again, that's a way of also thinking about South Africa also in relation to sort of like Indian Ocean diasporas in ways that I think questions of Blackness and anti-colonialism in dialogue with the Black Atlantic gives a particular kind of genealogy, right? So I think that there are those kinds of complicated questions, and that what does Blackness mean in this context where colonial states themselves can invest in particular notions of racial formations, where questions of mobility and diasporization get fixed, such as your colored means race. It doesn't mean all of these other forms of migration, etc. And yet, on the other hand, I mean, the sort of these really interesting histories of sort of Islam. Okay, I think one of the most famous and important musicians to come out of South Africa, Ibrahim, I think turning 90 this year. When one sort of thinks about the aesthetics of jazz and song playing composition, yes, it's South African and part of sort of longer African American tradition, but also I think quite consciously, since its own conversion to Islam in the late 1960s, I believe, that music is quite deeply in dialogue with that history, including thinking about local histories in Cape Town of sort of Muslim resistance, as well as important figures like Baghoolizadeh. So when one thinks about memory, it's interesting that how does one then begin to sort of figure genres of memory that fall outside of official categories, right? So jazz is actually a very interesting and important sort of form of thinking about not only collaboration in the sense of what are the kind of musicians that are in this room doing in relation to improvisation, composition, but what are the forms of assemblage that are being formed sonically in the process of composition that brings into the room other forms of history as well as other forms of temporality, right? So I think those are interesting.
Dr. Beeta, you have the last word.
I mean, I think I really dedicated my book to sort of figuring out the temporality around Blackness narratives, but now that I'm listening to Khwezi speak about South Africa, I'm really reminded by this book that was really important to me, when she was white. About she was born in South Africa to an Afrikaner family, but visibly black, but she's categorized as white.
Sutherland.
Is that, yes, I think so. Yes, her child, okay, thank you. And as the sort of political systems and political upheavals in South Africa are destabilized and move towards apartheid, her racial category, or like on her political documents, on her legal documents, change. And that really stayed with me, that these racial categories, sure, in some ways are true, but they're also constructed. And what do we do with that? How do we move through that? And an example like hers, I think is really important and instructive for us to look beyond just Iran, to understand race on a global scale, and then come back and see how it plays out in a regional or a national level.
So congratulations again, Dr. John. Thank you so much. Please join me. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, and take care.
Thank you.
Where can someone buy a copy of this brilliant book?
If you get it on the website of your university press.
And for people who are present, there are copies outside that are discounted to $20 today.
And the first 5 get 1 for free. Yeah. Yeah, the first 5. Thank you. Come on.
Yeah. I love it.
Thank you so much.
You see me like